Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to another Tourism Talks. And it's my very particular pleasure today to be able to welcome Paul Rybicki, who's the CEO of DSpark, who are members of TTF and great partners of TTF, and really add to our capacity to analyse and understand what's happening below the surface of the industry. So Paul, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Margy. Great to be here, and hello to everyone watching.
Can I just ask you maybe to start with, just give me a very tight little, what is it that DSpark engages in? I mean, we know you and love you, but maybe we give everybody an opportunity to understand what it is you do that is so special.
Yes, sure. So we are a data and analytics company. We ingest and get access to some amazing data sets, including those from telcos, including those from public transport networks, from roads networks. We actually have some information around the movement of foreign travellers who are here from abroad, ABS census, and I guess the special source that we provide is bringing all of that together, processing that, and making that available out for to clients and analysis. So once you combine all of that and once you get that out there, we effectively have access to and visibility of how the population moves, the whole population, whether that's Australians for reasons of transport or for reasons of tourism, or if it's those from abroad who are here travelling or commuting as well. So it's a very unique, large data set, and we're very proud of what we do and then what we make that available to and the problems that we solve with that.
So let's talk about some of that, because one of the things that's been really critical from TTF's perspective is to be able to understand what sort of movement has been happening in the marketplace. Where are people going? What are they doing? How long are they spending there? All of those kinds of things. And, if there's something the pandemic has done, I think, is get people to focus on the need for some innovation and a different way of thinking about things and a different kind of information. So do you want to talk a little bit about the sorts of trends you're seeing at the moment?
Yes. And I think the pandemic did another thing, which was a lot of the traditional sources of information went away, as in the ability to talk to someone at the airport about what they just did and where they went disappeared completely because there was no one at the airport. The traditional tap-on, tap-off systems to show where the movement of people is through the network disappeared because people weren't on the network at all. And so it was a really interesting dynamic for us where there was a real interest in the movement of people, but a real lack of information in that early period where it just wasn't available because the demand and the people weren't out there. So I think it's what did that mean for us and what did that show? We certainly showed and saw that the movement of people changed, that clearly people withdrew. There was a lot more activity in and around the home. There was a lot of shorter trips, but higher volume, shorter trips in and around the home as people self-isolated. Clearly, those trips into the CBD or into the place of work wasn't happening, and tourism, completely decimated through those early months, and we very much saw that. And a lot of the role that we played in those early days was just help to understand actually what's happening. Are people self-isolating as they've been advised to? Are people, in fact, not travelling within the radius that they've been asked not to travel? And if they are, where is that, and who's doing that, and what does that look like? So we were really early working on a lot of those sort of risk areas and cohorts and groups of people and where some of those things were happening where they shouldn't have. As things, I guess, recovered and were more under control, a lot of what we've been looking at now is more help me understand the recovery and where is that recovery and how is that progressing and how does that compare with one city to another. So, some of the trends we're seeing, if I even just look at some of the more recent data, we've got, cities like Sydney. Sydney's probably down about a third of volume of people going into the CBD relative to the baseline period pre-COVID. You're looking at Brisbane, it's probably about half of the people are trending and actually coming back into the CBD. Adelaide is probably one of the best performing cities in terms of it's about a quarter down pre-COVID. But obviously with some recent changes in the last few days, that might have changed. But as early as, a week ago, we're certainly seeing those trends start to return. But there's still big gaps to pre-COVID times, and the volume of people travelling into the CBDs are still certainly nowhere near where they used to be.
So just in terms of, using this sort of technology to to be able to assess those kinds of things. It's going to become an increasingly important part of how governments design policy and solutions, isn't it? I mean, you can't afford to leave this to chance and the occasional survey. If you can track somebody's phone, you know an awful lot more about where they're going and what they're doing.
Yes, that's right, and I think it's a number of things. It's the ability to see what is actually happening, not what people are telling you happened or what they did. And I think there's always a little bit of that bias, what you remember, what you think you did versus what you actually did. So I think this sort of data set really helps with the reality of what happened. There's also the sample size. So the ability to be able to, not ask thousands of people those questions, but see millions of people and tens of millions of people over the course of days and weeks, those movement patterns. And again, that allows you to cut things in many different ways that some of those traditional sources just don't allow you to do. I think there's still very much a place for surveys and for the, why did you do things and how did you feel about it and what might you do next? But certainly this type of technology and data allows you to get a much better and more granular sense of what did you do, what actually happened, what was the reaction, and how did that change this morning from yesterday in this suburb to this suburb, in this gender and this age cohort. So the ability to cut into such a much smaller level of analysis is really quite groundbreaking. So that's exciting for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just thinking back to one of the first pieces of work you did for us as part of the COVID exercise was, looking at people's intra-state travel patterns and how far they were prepared to travel. And, from that, we were able to see that, people really don't want to travel more than about 4 hours from a capital city and preferably no more than 2. So it's somewhere in the middle. And that's really important because it allows us then to start thinking about, well, will the infrastructure in that 2 to 4 hour zone, in fact, be able to support this massive influx of extra tourists? I mean, do you want to talk me through sort of what that looks like, in different states? That's a consistent pattern now, isn't it?
It certainly is. I mean, it's a function of you can't fly as freely as you used to be able to. It's a function of obviously certain borders are closed where others aren't, and so that's naturally driving a certain behaviour. And we're seeing that behaviour. So we've done work with you on various things around whether it's long weekends or the impact on school holidays. And I guess what we're seeing is not only the volume, but we've had a really interesting, we worked with Gold Coast Council on a piece that actually looked at the economic impact. So we looked at that really early in the piece, Easter weekend this year versus last year, and the tourism inbound volume into the Gold Coast on that particular weekend. And it's you're probably getting about 20% of the volume of people in on that Easter weekend year on year. And overlaying that on an economic impact, you're probably talking about 20 to 25 million revenue that the Gold Coast had lost from tourism on that one particular weekend. So your ability to do that and see that is really quite interesting. What we're seeing now is, as again, things start to open up and people do start to travel, those sort of dynamics, as you mentioned, for a long weekend, people do seem to be comfortable. There's a sweet spot in between that 2 and 4 hour period. And that does vary somewhat by city, but that's certainly the range. But we do see that. But what we also do see is, if I look at some of the tourism regions, again, and this is just comparing the last few weeks year on year, and if I look at who's overperforming or underperforming, if you look at, say, the southwest region, so Perth and sort of Bunbury and Albany and those areas, they're actually performing above what they were doing this time last year. So there's clearly a lot of domestic tourism in that part of Australia. If I look at other areas like I mentioned the Gold Coast, so Gold Coast is probably down about a quarter in terms of traffic, in terms of domestic tourists. Places like Phillip Island is really suffering, where they're probably getting about in a fortnight about 100,000 tourists. They're getting a bit over half that. So huge volume impacts on certain places. Adelaide Hills down about 15%. If I then, and that's sort of all domestic tourism, but if I then look at international, I mean, you're talking about single percentage points of what it was year on year across all of the tourism regions, really. So that's clearly a big impact. But some of the areas, most areas are down. I would say anywhere from 10 to 40% year on year. But there are some little pockets like that southwest, south of Perth, Margaret River pocket that is actually performing better. So it is interesting, and not only. It's not only about looking at the trend of where those people are coming from. Is it intra or inter? But also by cities, by tourism regions, by different events, whether that's, long weekends, or even what happens when the border opens. What's the immediate impact that you're getting out there? And that's certainly a lot of the things that we'd be looking at. So, certainly recovery is the theme at the moment that this sort of data set is being used for, and planning for that and catching that at the right times.
I mean, well, I think the other one that strikes me out of this too is you mentioned before people's changed work patterns. And so many transport agencies now around the country have been looking for a few years now at the so-called new mobility and the options in terms of localised transport models and what's going to be needed. I would imagine the capacity to track people's behaviours in this space and understand how many of them are not returning to the city and are confined within quite a local bubble is going to be a very useful piece.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And I think before what we were using this data for with some clients, whether they're Transport for New South Wales or TMRs of the world, is looking at the pockets in the normal environment of where on-demand transport suits a need or fixes a problem or has the biggest impact based on reliability of a trip that someone makes daily, whether it's work to home, home to work or other. What we're now seeing is, because of that changing behaviour, there's an opportunity to rethink some of that on-demand service because it might have a better and serve a better local purpose. Because as people are working from home, or their dynamic changes, or even, this concept of a different peak time, what does that actually look like? And does that in fact change, or does it return to the peak that we had, but it's just a smaller peak because you've got smaller volumes? So, that's where some of that more innovative transport solution, I think, again, benefits from the data, because you can look at the actual volume, you can look at the baseline, you can look at reliability, and then, potentially target on-demand services and services like that against that. And in particular, understanding not only the pockets of reliability on the network, but off the network. So the first mile and last mile, and what does that look like for people now versus what it did before? As again, an opportunity to solve the problem perhaps better than would be otherwise possible with more traditional data sets.
Well, I have to say, Paul, we're out of time, but there's no doubt in my mind that data is king, and you are the king of data. So thank you very much for all of the material you supplied us. I think it's made a material difference to our capacity to talk about aspects of the tourism and transport industry over the last 7 or 8 months. So thank you again, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Pleasure, Margy. Thank you very much.